I stood at the office kitchenette, rinsing out a coffee mug someone had left in the sink. The low hum of conversation from the break area barely registered in my mind until I heard my name. "Look at her," Marissa Harris scoffed, her voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Straight out of some trailer park, probably. How long do you think she'll last here? A month? Maybe 2? A round of quiet chuckles followed. I didn't turn around. I kept washing the mug, taking my time as if I hadn't heard a thing. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for some kind of reaction, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I dried the mug, placed it back on the shelf, and walked out of the kitchenette as if nothing had happened. It had been 2 weeks since I started at Westbridge Tech, one of the most prestigious tech firms in the country. From the moment I walked in, I had felt it. The unspoken hierarchy, the careful division of insiders and outsiders. I had seen it before in other places, but here it was more ruthless. It wasn't just about how well you did your job, it was about perception. The way you dressed, the way you spoke, the way you carried yourself. And to them, I didn't belong. I didn't wear designer suits like the other women in the office. I didn't flaunt expensive jewelry or talk about my weekends at luxury resorts. I kept my head down, did my work, and stayed out of office gossip. But that only made them more curious, more cruel. At first, it had been small things, forgetting to copy me on important emails, rolling their eyes when I spoke up in meetings, laughing behind my back when I didn't understand an inside joke. But then, it escalated. On my second day, Marissa had sent me out to get coffee for the team. I had done it without complaint, but when I brought it back, they had handed me a handful of pennies as a tip. "Here," Marissa had said with a smirk, "for your troubles. I know every little bit helps." Laughter erupted around me. I simply took the coins and placed them in my pocket. I had learned long ago that reacting only made people push harder. Then there was the meeting. I had spent all night preparing a report, running through analytics, making sure my data was flawless. It was my chance to prove myself. But the morning of the meeting, Marissa had waltzed in, taken one look at my neatly printed charts, and then, in front of everyone, said, "Oh, you don't mind if I present this, right? I mean, I already have the floor." She didn't even wait for an answer. I had sat there watching as she rattled off my research, pretending like she had done all the work. The executives nodded along, impressed. "Well done, Marissa," one of them had said. "This is exactly the kind of initiative we like to see." I had stayed silent. And now today they had gone a step further. I had spent the entire morning preparing files for an important client presentation, double-checking every detail. Just as I was about to head to the conference room, someone had called my name from the back office. "Anna, can you help me for a sec?" I had turned and walked toward the voice. As soon as I stepped into the narrow file room, the door had slammed shut behind me. I tried the handle, locked. Outside, muffled laughter. "Oops," someone said from the other side. "Guess she'll miss the meeting." I exhaled slowly. I checked my watch. The meeting was starting in 5 minutes. They thought they had won, but they had underestimated me. I pulled out my phone and sent a single message. Then, I walked to the back of the file room where I had noticed a small ventilation panel earlier that week. It was old and loose, probably never maintained properly. I kicked it hard and the panel fell open. The gap was small, but I squeezed through, emerging into an empty hallway on the other side. 2 minutes later, I walked into the conference room. Marissa had already started, looking completely at ease, standing in front of the screen, clicking through slides that I had prepared. When she spotted me in the doorway, her smile faltered for just a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of panic in her eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply walked to the back of the room, took a seat, and crossed my legs. I watched, listened, memorized every false word she spoke. By the end of the day, the whispers had already started. How did she get out? She didn't even look mad. What's her deal? Marissa had laughed it off in front of her friends, but I had seen the way she kept glancing in my direction, uneasy. That night, as I left the building, I checked my phone again. A new reply had come in, a single word. Confirmed. I smiled to myself and slipped the phone back into my pocket. They had no idea what was coming. The day after the incident in the file room, the office felt different. Not outwardly, of course. People still moved through the halls with purpose, tapping away at their phones, chatting in small groups about weekend plans. But beneath the surface, I could feel it. The way some people looked at me a second too long. The way conversations quieted when I passed by. They were starting to pay attention. Marissa, however, seemed determined to act like nothing had happened. She laughed with her usual group at lunch, complained about an intern messing up a spreadsheet, and walked past my desk without so much as a glance. But I noticed how she stiffened every time someone mentioned the client presentation. How she kept checking her phone when she thought no one was looking. At first, I wasn't sure if she had put together that I was behind what happened next. Maybe she was too arrogant to believe I had any influence. Maybe she thought it was just bad luck. But when the email arrived in everyone's inbox just before lunch, I saw the exact moment she realized. Due to discrepancies in recent reporting, a mandatory internal audit will be conducted on all departmental operations effective immediately. Employees may be required to provide documentation regarding recent projects, expenditures, and communications. Your full cooperation is expected. I could almost hear the silence that spread across the floor as people read the message. It was the kind of email that made everyone uncomfortable. Audits meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant someone had been caught doing something they shouldn't. People shifted in their chairs, whispered to one another, speculated on what had prompted it, but I kept my eyes on Marissa. She was staring at her screen, her fingers clenched so tightly around her mouse that her knuckles turned white. She took a slow breath, rolled her shoulders back, and forced a smile onto her face before standing up. I knew where she was going. She walked straight to Jason Marshall's office. Jason, the regional director, the man she had been carefully cozying up to for the past year. She knocked once before stepping inside, closing the door behind her. I turned back to my screen, but I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. She was trying to get ahead of the situation, downplay whatever was about to come out. When she emerged 15 minutes later, her expression was unreadable. But the tension in her jaw, the way she barely looked at anyone as she walked back to her desk, told me that the meeting had not gone the way she wanted. The rest of the day was uneventful, but the undercurrent of unease remained. People were more careful with their conversations, more aware of who was around them. Marissa avoided eye contact with me completely, but I could feel the weight of her attention, like she was watching me through her peripheral vision. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, she walked by my desk and stopped. "Funny timing, isn't it?" she said casually, her voice light but her eyes sharp. I looked up. "What is—" She gestured vaguely toward the office. "This audit. It's just strange. No warning, no real explanation. And after yesterday's little incident—" She trailed off, watching me carefully. I met her gaze, letting a small smile form on my lips. I guess some things have a way of working themselves out. Her nostrils flared just slightly before she exhaled and forced a smirk. "Well, you'd better be careful, Walker. People don't like surprises in places like this." I tilted my head slightly. Good thing I don't mind them then. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her expression, doubt. She left without another word. That night, I sat in my apartment, going through my notes. The pieces were already falling into place. The audit wasn't just for show. It was a direct consequence of what I had uncovered. Over the past week, I had been quietly collecting data, following patterns, cross-referencing reports. I had noticed inconsistencies in financial projections, contracts that didn't quite match up, expenses that seemed off. And now, with the auditors involved, those inconsistencies were going to become impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed. A message. "Documents received. Reviewing now." I locked my phone and leaned back in my chair. Marissa thought this was just about office politics, about status, about me trying to get back at her for making my life difficult. She had no idea how much bigger this was. The next morning, the audit team arrived. 3 men and 1 woman, all in sharp suits, all carrying laptops and folders. They set up in a conference room, and within the first hour, emails started rolling in, requests for files, access to systems, clarification on transactions. People who had spent years ignoring protocol were suddenly scrambling to account for their work. Marissa was tense but composed. She smiled at the auditors, answered their questions, acted like she had nothing to hide. but I saw the way she hesitated before responding to certain things, the way her eyes flickered toward her computer screen before she spoke. She was trying to control the damage, trying to steer the conversation away from anything that could implicate her. But it was too late. By lunchtime, the cracks were starting to show. A financial analyst from accounting was called in for questioning, then a project manager, then another. At one point, Marissa disappeared for almost an hour, and when she returned, her face was pale. Around 3 in the afternoon, she received a call. She answered it at her desk, her voice low, but I was close enough to catch pieces of it. "What? No, there must be some mistake. Those numbers were approved months ago. She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temple. "No, I understand. Yes. I'll get everything together." She hung up without another word. When she looked up, her eyes met mine for just a second, and for the first time, I saw something real in them: fear. The email came in at the end of the day. Employees listed below are required to provide full documentation regarding their most recent transactions. Failure to comply may result in disciplinary action. Marissa's name was at the top of the list. I closed my laptop and stood up, stretching slightly before heading toward the elevators. As I stepped inside, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls, calm, collected, in control. They thought they had me figured out. They had no idea how far ahead I was. The next morning, the tension in the office was palpable. People moved through the halls more quietly, heads down, fingers tapping nervously on their keyboards. The audit had turned from an abstract inconvenience into something real, something that had weight. No one said it outright, but everyone knew what was happening. Someone had triggered this, and now the company was looking for blood. I could see it in the way my coworkers glanced at each other, suspicion creeping into their expressions. Everyone was wondering the same thing: who was responsible? Marissa was doing her best to act like nothing had changed. She strolled into the office with her usual confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her coffee cup in hand. But I noticed the little details. The way her fingers gripped the cup tighter than usual. The way she forced a smile when people greeted her. The way she avoided making direct eye contact with anyone for too long. She was unraveling, piece by piece. I settled into my desk, logging into my computer, pretending to be just as uncertain as everyone else. I listened to the murmurs, the whispered theories. Some thought it was someone from accounting trying to cover their tracks. Others speculated that a high-level executive was using the audit as an excuse to clean house. No one suspected me. Not yet. By mid-morning, the first real blow landed. An email from corporate compliance landed in inboxes across the department. Employees were required to submit individual reports detailing their involvement in all major projects over the past 6 months. Every budget approval, every expense request, every financial projection, everything needed to be accounted for. It wasn't just a standard audit anymore. They were hunting for something specific. I glanced across the room at Marissa. She was staring at her screen, perfectly still. Then, slowly, she exhaled, rolled her shoulders back, and stood up. She walked toward Jason Marshall's office again, but this time, she knocked and waited instead of barging in. He barely looked up when he waved her inside, shutting the door behind them. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know how it was going. Jason wasn't going to save her. He was a survivor. If he thought Marissa was a liability, he wouldn't hesitate to throw her under the bus. She had spent so much time playing office politics, climbing over people, making sure she was untouchable, but now, when she actually needed protection, there was no one left to shield her. She reappeared 20 minutes later, her expression neutral, but her movements stiffer than before. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and immediately began typing. Damage control? I turned my attention back to my own work, reviewing the data I had been compiling for weeks. The irregularities in financial reports, the inconsistencies in expense justifications, the quietly approved vendor payments that didn't quite add up. It was all there, laid out in front of me. And now, the audit team was seeing it too. At lunchtime, I overheard a hushed conversation near the elevators. 2 employees from accounting were talking in low voices, their backs turned to the rest of the office. "They're looking at vendor contracts now," one of them said. Something about duplicate invoices, payments going out under different account names. "Who's involved?" the other asked. "I don't know, but I heard Marissa's name come up more than once." I let their words sink in, then walked past them as if I hadn't heard a thing. Marissa wasn't in the office when I returned from lunch. Her bag was still at her desk, her monitor still on, but her chair was empty. I had a feeling I knew where she was. She was trying to get ahead of whatever was coming next. The next time I saw her was late in the afternoon. She was standing in the hallway near the executive suites, talking to someone I didn't recognize, a man in a dark suit holding a leather briefcase. A lawyer. She was already preparing for the worst. By the time I made it back to my desk, another email had arrived. The audit team had flagged multiple transactions for further review. A meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Select employees were required to attend and provide clarification on certain discrepancies. Marissa's name was listed at the top. She returned to her desk just as people were starting to leave for the day. She sat down, pulled out her phone, and stared at it for a long time before finally typing something. Then she set it down, exhaled, and turned toward me. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Her voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath. I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She leaned forward slightly. "I don't know how you did it, but I know this is you. The audit, the flagged reports, all of it. You've been playing some kind of game since the moment you got here. But let me tell you something, Walker. You don't know who you're messing with." I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "And what exactly do you think I've done?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied me, as if trying to figure out what my next move would be. Finally, she shook her head, letting out a quiet laugh. "You're not as smart as you think you are." I shrugged. "Maybe not, but I guess we'll find out soon enough." She scoffed, grabbing her phone and standing up. "Enjoy this while you can. It won't last." I watched her walk away, her shoulders stiff, her pace just a little too fast. She was scared, and that meant I was exactly where I needed to be. That night, as I left the office, my phone buzzed, another message. "Tomorrow." I locked my screen, slipping the phone into my pocket as I stepped outside. The game was almost over. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the tension in the office had reached its breaking point. Conversations were quieter, movements more calculated, and the usual hum of casual chatter had been replaced with the sound of people furiously typing emails or whispering in corners. No one wanted to be caught off guard. No one wanted to be the next name on the audit team's list. Marissa arrived later than usual, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something off about her today. Her usual air of effortless confidence had been replaced with something more rigid, more forced. She kept her head high, her steps deliberate, but I noticed the way she gripped the strap of her bag a little too tightly, how her fingers tapped against her phone screen as she stood by the elevators, hesitating before finally walking toward her office. She was waiting for something, or maybe she was bracing for it. By noon, everyone knew why. A second email had gone out, and this time, it wasn't just about financial discrepancies. Employees under review were now required to provide personal statements regarding their involvement in specific projects, as well as any communication records related to vendor approvals. It wasn't just about the money anymore. They were looking at intent. And intent could get people fired. Marissa's name was at the top of the list again. So was Jason Marshall's. That was when the real whispers started. Jason had always been untouchable, too high up the corporate ladder for anyone to challenge. If they were investigating him, that meant they weren't just cleaning up bad bookkeeping. They were digging for something serious. And that meant Marissa was no longer the highest target. She was just the first step. I kept my head down, typing at my computer, pretending to focus on work while emails and Slack messages flooded my screen. People were trying to figure out what was going on, who had spoken to whom, what exactly was about to happen in the closed-door meetings that had been scheduled for the afternoon. Marissa had disappeared into her office, her blinds shut, her door locked. Every so often, I could see the faint shadow of her pacing back and forth. At exactly 1 p.m., Jason was called into a meeting with the audit team. He didn't return for hours. At 2:30, Marissa was next. I watched her stand, smooth out her blouse, and take a deep breath before walking toward the conference room. She didn't look at anyone. The door closed behind her and the office waited. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. People were pretending to work, but everyone's attention was elsewhere. The meeting was stretching longer than expected, which meant either Marissa was talking or they were finding more than they anticipated. When the door finally opened, she stepped out, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't go back to her desk. She went straight to the elevators and left. I exhaled slowly, turning back to my screen, checking the time. This was happening faster than I thought. The next move would come soon, I just had to be ready for it. By the time I was gathering my things for the day, a few people had already left early. The weight of the investigation had drained everyone. No one wanted to linger. As I zipped up my bag, my phone vibrated on my desk. A new message. Be in early tomorrow. I locked my screen, glancing around the office one last time before heading out. The next morning, I arrived before most of the office. A few others had the same idea, people who wanted to get ahead of whatever was coming, to pretend they weren't rattled by the events of the past few days. I settled into my desk, opened my laptop, and waited. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the first termination happened. A middle manager from finance, then a procurement specialist, then an executive assistant. 3 people escorted out, their computers remotely locked before they even had a chance to sit down. No one spoke, no one looked away from their screens. At 9:15, Jason Marshall was called into the CEO's office. He never returned. And then, at 10 a.m., Marissa walked in. She moved slower today. Her usual sharpness dulled, her posture less perfect, but her expression was unreadable. She set her bag down at her desk, logged into her computer, and sat there, staring at her screen. The office watched her, waiting for the final blow. But it didn't come. Instead, at 10:30, another email arrived. Please join us for an all-staff meeting in Conference Room A at 11 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. Mandatory. That meant it wasn't just a regular update. That meant decisions had already been made. I stood, stretching slightly before making my way toward the conference room with the rest of the team. People murmured as they found seats, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, eyes darting toward the front of the room where the executives were already waiting. Marissa took a seat near the back. The CEO stepped forward. He looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him. He cleared his throat, glanced at his notes, and began. As most of you are aware, we have been undergoing an internal audit over the past several days. Due to the findings of that investigation, certain personnel decisions have been made. He paused, looking out over the room. Effective immediately, Jason Marshall is no longer with the company. The tension in the room deepened. Jason had been here for years. People whispered, exchanging glances, but the CEO wasn't finished. Additionally, we have identified serious breaches of compliance within our procurement and vendor relations teams. As a result, further changes will be taking place. We expect full cooperation as we move forward. He nodded toward HR, who stepped forward with folders, calling out names. One by one, employees stood, collected their paperwork, and left the room. Some were pale, others furious. Marissa sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, waiting. And then her name wasn't called. She exhaled just barely, just enough for me to notice. When the meeting ended, people scattered, whispering in corridors, trying to understand what had just happened. Marissa returned to her desk, shoulders back, head high, like she had won something, like she had survived. But I knew better. I passed by her desk as I left for the day, pausing just long enough to let my fingers brush against the edge of her chair. She looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. You really thought it would happen today, didn't you? I said, my voice quiet enough that only she could hear. She stared at me, then let out a short, bitter laugh. You don't know anything, Walker. I tilted my head slightly. Don't I? She held my gaze for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind her expression. Then she turned back to her screen, dismissing me like I was nothing. I smiled as I walked away, slipping my phone out of my pocket, checking the new message that had just come in. Tomorrow. I locked my screen, stepping onto the elevator, my pulse steady. She thought today had been the worst of it. She had no idea what was coming next. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual. The office was nearly empty, just a few people at their desks, their eyes heavy from a week of tension and uncertainty. I took my time settling in, placing my bag carefully beside my chair, powering on my laptop, sipping my coffee as I glanced over my emails. There it was, a single unread message sitting at the top of my inbox. The subject line was simple, final review, 10 a.m. I clicked it open. Anna, Please report to conference room B at 10 a.m. for a final review meeting regarding the ongoing audit. Your presence is required. Corporate compliance team. I stared at the screen for a moment, then leaned back in my chair, right on schedule. Across the office, Marissa walked in exactly at 9 a.m., dressed impeccably as always, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She moved through the space with deliberate confidence, nodding at people, offering a polite but distant smile. But I noticed the way she glanced at Jason's now empty office as she passed. The way her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She hadn't forgotten what had happened yesterday, she just didn't know yet if she had escaped the worst of it. At 9:30, I received another email. This one was brief. See me before your meeting. I logged out of my system and stood, making my way down the quiet hallway toward the executive wing. I knocked once before pushing open the office door. He was already waiting, seated behind his desk, a thick folder resting in front of him. He gestured for me to sit. You ready? He asked, flipping open the folder. I nodded, always. He scanned the documents, tapping his fingers against the edge of the desk. We finalized everything last night. The board signed off on it this morning. By the end of the day, Marissa Harris will no longer be an employee of this company. I exhaled slowly, nodding again, absorbing the words. She doesn't know yet? No, he said, not officially. She thinks she made it through. He closed the folder, leaning forward slightly, and that's where you come in. I tilted my head. You want me to be the one to tell her? His eyes met mine, unwavering. She made it personal the second she started playing games with you. I think it's only fair she hears it from you first. A slow smile curled at the edge of my lips. I couldn't agree more. At exactly 9:55 a.m., I walked back into the main office, making my way toward conference room B. Marissa was already inside, seated at the long glass table, a notepad open in front of her, a pen resting between her fingers. She looked up when I entered, her expression cool but unreadable. She didn't speak as I pulled out a chair across from her. The compliance officer at the head of the table cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before beginning. Ms. Harris, as you know, our team has spent the last week conducting a thorough internal audit. During this process, we reviewed financial transactions, vendor contracts, and departmental communications. As of this morning, the board has reached its final decision. He slid a document across the table toward her. Effective immediately, your employment with Westbridge Tech is terminated. Marissa's fingers curled around the pen, but her face remained unreadable. She blinked once, slowly, as if processing the words at her own pace. Then, finally, she let out a quiet breath and set the pen down. I see, she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. And on what grounds, exactly? The compliance officer folded his hands in front of him. Your department was found to be in violation of multiple company policies regarding vendor relations and financial reporting. Furthermore, we obtained evidence that you knowingly approved fraudulent invoices, resulting in unauthorized payments exceeding— Save the speech, she interrupted, pushing back from the table. I know how this works. She stood, smoothing out her blouse, adjusting the strap of her watch. Then, for the first time since I entered the room, her eyes locked onto mine. You, she said, her voice softer now, almost amused. Of course it was you. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head slightly. You think this is a win, don't you, that you played the long game and came out on top? She tilted her head. But I know people, Walker, and people like me, we don't disappear. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. Neither do I. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she exhaled through her nose, shaking her head again as she reached for the termination letter. She held it between her fingers, glancing over the words, before slipping it into her bag. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. Marissa was gone. It happened faster than I expected. No drawn-out meetings, no desperate attempts to talk her way out of it. She had walked out of that conference room, termination letter tucked neatly into her bag, and she hadn't looked back. No dramatic speeches, no last-ditch efforts to manipulate her way into staying, just silence. And yet, as I sat at my desk that afternoon, typing out an email as if it were just another ordinary day, I could feel the remnants of her presence in the office. The way people whispered in hushed tones near the break room, the way their eyes flicked toward her now empty desk as they passed by. The way some of them seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if this was really over. But I knew better. People like Marissa didn't disappear quietly. I closed out of my email and leaned back slightly in my chair, glancing toward the hallway that led to the executive offices. The real work wasn't finished yet. Marissa was only part of the equation. She had been a convenient pawn, a disposable piece in a much larger game. But now that she was out, the board was shifting. I turned back to my screen and pulled up the internal reports I had been compiling for weeks. Financial inconsistencies, questionable vendor transactions, approval signatures that didn't quite match across multiple documents. The audit had been the perfect distraction. While the company had been focused on Marissa, I had been digging deeper, peeling back layers that went far beyond one department's mismanagement. The rut went higher. At 3 p.m., a meeting request popped up on my calendar. Anna, CEO's office, 3:30 p.m. I let out a slow breath and closed my laptop. Right on schedule. When I arrived outside the CEO's office, his assistant barely glanced up before motioning for me to go inside. I stepped through the door, shutting it quietly behind me. The CEO, Richard Hale, was seated behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he studied a thick file in front of him. He didn't look up right away. "You've been busy," he finally said, flipping a page. To respond, I waited. He exhaled, setting the file down before finally meeting my gaze. "You didn't just come here to work, did you?" "No," I said simply. He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then tell me, why did you come here?" I stepped forward, placing a neatly organized stack of documents onto his desk. Because Marissa was never the real problem. She was sloppy, yes, corrupt, definitely. But she wasn't the only one. He glanced at the papers, but didn't reach for them yet. "Go on." I crossed my arms. Westbridge Tech has been bleeding money for years, not enough to raise immediate red flags, but enough that anyone looking closely would start to ask questions. The audit covered the surface-level discrepancies. Marissa's department, a few questionable invoices, but that's just the beginning. His expression remained unreadable. "And what exactly have you found?" "Jason Marshall was involved in more than just bad vendor contracts," I continued. "He funneled company resources into private accounts, covered up losses by shifting funds between different subsidiaries, and used his position to approve deals that benefited third-party companies with direct ties to former executives. And that's just what I found with limited access. If you give me full clearance to the internal financial logs, I can guarantee you there's more." Silence stretched between us. Then slowly, Richard Hale leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp as he studied me. "And what exactly do you want in exchange for this information?" I smiled. "Nothing." His brow lifted slightly, the first real sign of surprise. "Nothing?" I shook my head. "You don't need to offer me anything, Mr. Hale, because at the end of the day, you need me more than I need you. The board isn't going to let this slide. They're already on edge after the audit. If they find out that this company has been hemorrhaging money under your leadership, they won't hesitate to remove you. You need to clean this up before they get the chance to dig any deeper on their own. And I'm the only one in this building who knows exactly where to look." For the first time since I had walked in, he let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You remind me of someone I used to work with." "Hopefully not Jason Marshall," I said dryly. That made him laugh again, but the humor faded quickly. He tapped his fingers against his desk, glancing down at the documents once more before finally picking them up. "If I give you full access, you find everything, no matter where it leads, no matter who it implicates." I nodded. "That's the deal." A long silence passed. Then he reached for his phone, pressed a button, and spoke into the receiver. "Get Anna Walker the clearance she needs, full access, effective immediately." A moment later, he hung up, his gaze settling on me once more. "You just made a lot of powerful people very nervous, Anna." I smiled. "Good." I turned and walked out of his office without another word, my heart steady, my mind already racing ahead to the next steps. This wasn't just about Marissa. It never had been. She was just the beginning. And by the time I was finished, there wouldn't be a single corrupt executive left standing. The moment I walked out of Richard Hale's office, I knew the real work had begun. Everything that had happened before, the whispered office politics, the small retaliations, the slow unraveling of Marissa's career, had just been a prelude. Now, I wasn't just exposing one corrupt executive. I was tearing apart a system that had thrived on manipulation and greed for years, and I had full access to do it. Back at my desk, a new email waited in my inbox. Your requested access has been approved. Please use your updated credentials to log in. I clicked the link, entered my information, and a second later I was inside. The financial records of Westbridge Tech, unrestricted. No firewalls, no limited visibility. Everything was in front of me. I started digging immediately. For the next several hours, I barely looked up from my screen. Transaction logs, approval records, internal emails, it was all there, woven together like a web, each thread connecting executives, vendors, and off-the-books accounts. Jason Marshall had been deep in it, but he wasn't alone. There were signatures from multiple high-ranking employees, including one I hadn't expected, Daniel Crow, the CFO. He had been careful, making sure his name rarely appeared on the most questionable transactions, but the patterns were clear. Money shifting between subsidiaries with no legitimate explanation, inflated invoices paid to shell companies, contracts awarded to firms with direct ties to former executives. They had built an entire shadow operation within the company, draining millions while maintaining the illusion of clean financials. And now I had the proof. At exactly 6 p.m., I compiled the final report and sent it directly to Richard Hale. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. My office. Now, I logged out, grabbed my notes, and headed down the hall. When I stepped inside, Hale was standing by his window staring out at the city, the thick folder of evidence open on his desk. He didn't turn around when he spoke. You realize what this means, don't you? His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Yes, I said. It means this company has a chance to fix itself before it collapses completely. He exhaled sharply, finally turning to face me. You just handed me enough evidence to take down half of my executive team. Then take them down, I said simply. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. I will. The next morning, the fallout began. By noon, Daniel Crow had been escorted out of the building. 3 other senior executives followed. Their offices were cleared, their access revoked, their careers shattered in the span of a few hours. The news spread fast, and by the afternoon, the board had called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. The outcome was obvious. Hale had saved himself by acting first, proving that he was willing to clean house before anyone could blame him for what had happened under his watch. By the end of the week, the company had changed. Marissa was gone, Jason was gone. The financial web they had built was untangled, exposed for everyone to see, and me? I was still here, sitting at my desk like nothing had happened, watching as the office slowly adjusted to its new reality. People were careful now, more respectful. The same people who had once dismissed me as nothing more than a quiet nobody now looked at me with something else. Uncertainty, maybe even a little fear. And Marissa? I had almost expected her to reach out, to send one final email, to try one last time to salvage whatever power she thought she had. But she didn't. She was gone, wiped from the company's system like she had never existed. Still, I knew I hadn't seen the last of her. People like Marissa didn't disappear. They waited, they rebuilt, and when the time was right, they tried again. But that was fine. I would be ready.